Good morning. Tony Christ here with Sunshine and Transparency. This is we've done a number of podcasts on various topics of interest, and this one should be no different. It's our second week to cover U.S. medical coverage, what the state of affairs are with our medical system in America. And just to sum up, last week we talked about how the system was transitioning about 2008 into the Affordable Care Act, which was Obamacare. And we talked about that transition had occurred largely after the turn of the century. And there were two or three other laws that were changed that preceded it. And but what we didn't cover was the escalation in cost from a cost of about less than, 8.8%, 8.9% of GDP in 1980 to the present day cost of near 18% of GDP. And that's a huge increase. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and why it might cost so much more. I mean, you would think if anything costs that much more, there should be additional benefits. And the benefits are more illusory. And again, for those of you who didn't hear the podcast last week, we spent a good deal of time talking about the doctor-patient relationship and the fact that there was not a third-party payer system in everybody's life, and that the doctor and patient had a much closer relationship. And the doctor was definitely more responsive to the patient's needs and not to some third-party schedule of payments. And when that left, it sort of bifurcated that relationship. It changed it, and it changed it in a number of ways. You had, on the one hand, patients who no longer, in many instances, no longer bore a cost for their medical care, not either through a deductible on an insurance policy or directly. And it changed individuals' behavior and attitude toward medicine. I brought up an old quote from many, many years ago by Will Rogers, who said, "You think medicine is expensive now? Wait till it's free." And for many people today, particularly all the older generation who's on Medicare and the beneficiaries of Obamacare, which is an extension of it, it is free. The level of service is practically free, but the expenses have gone through the roof. We talked about the need to have, in a third-party payer system, to have a lot of additional employees with the doctor in the doctor's office to handle all the claims. Because since the patient isn't directly paying, he may have a deductible I mentioned earlier, but generally he's not paying. Generally, the government is picking up 53% of all medical bills, and so-called insurance companies pick up the vast majority of the rest of the expense. It requires, on every visit, it requires an application to submit to either the federal government or to a so-called insurance company. It requires a staff of people willing to do it. And again, to repeat the math, if you're a doctor, you're seeing, let's say, 6 patients an hour, 48 a day, 240 a week. That's 240 applications that you need to have staff to submit for you. Again, you're no longer dealing directly with the patient in costs. And in addition, there has to be personnel at the other end to receive 240 applications, be it with a so-called insurance company or with the government itself. And one of three things will happen: they will accept the claim, they will reject the claim, or they'll partially accept the claim. And in two instances, the doctor's office has to resubmit. They have to either resubmit the claim, the bill, or the balance of the bill to the insurance company again, or to the individual to collect the balance it's owed. We also talked about almost 20% of medical bills not being paid. We talked about very recently in 2023, I believe there were 80 filings of bankruptcies by medical providers. In 24 recently, there was a 33 hospital chain that filed for protection under bankruptcy, and there were 12 hospitals that shuttered the doors, just closed down. Now, many of these hospitals are physician-owned hospitals. They're for-profit hospitals. But due to the structures and the regulations and the responsibilities of the federal government in oversight, they've created a world where the hospital can no longer thrive. Also, the same is true with private doctors in practice. If you go back to last century, private doctors in practice were dominant. 80–90% of all doctors had an office, a secretary, nurse, and themselves, and were handling their own bills. Well, a number of things have happened since the federal government in the early 2000s nudged in and took control of medicine. One of the things is, aside from bifurcating the relationship between the traditional relationship between the patient and doctor, the amount of malpractice suits has gone through the roof, and malpractice insurance has gone straight up. And that has been one of the factors, along with the doctor's need to hire a number of additional people to submit 240 claims a week so they can get paid. And those are some of the monetary issues that have worked against the private practice physician and driven them in hordes into working for hospitals. As a matter of fact, 100,000 physicians left private practice last year and joined hospital systems, which was not desirable for them either, and get paid by the hospital system. And the system itself is going to have all kinds of rules and regulations and try to abide by the federal rules and regulations. So let's take a look at some of what is going on today after these changes in our medical care evolved in the first quarter, almost quarter century of this new century, the first quarter of this new century. And let's go back and take a look. In 1980, longevity was 73.61 years, average lifespan for an American. We were paying less than 9% of GDP for our health insurance. And that in 2000 went up to our average longevity increased about 3 years to 76.64, which was a marginal improvement. However, GDP jumped up to 13.3 in the year 2000. That incidentally is a record, the 13.3 in the world as a percent of GDP to pay for medical expenses. And hold that fact in place, because we're going to talk about rankings and results in other systems that are less expensive, which is a main sort of a focus of this paper. So in 22, our longevity declined. So from 2000 to 2022, 22 years later, Americans were living 76.4 years, a decline of a little bit more than 1%. However, our costs, our percent of GDP skyrocketed to 17.3%, which is uh, 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 quite an increase. And the increase took us up to spending for every man, woman, and child in America $13,493 in medical care. That's a world record. I mean, the next highest country, Germany, is a little over 12% of GDP, and here we are at 17.3. In 23, it got worse. The cost went up about 5.5%. The GDP went up, and our total medical expenditure was 4.84 trillion with a T, and that amounted to 17.7% of GDP, approaching 18% of gross domestic product for medical treatment. There's a peer group of 14 countries that I use to compare us with. They're mostly European countries, but the average expenditure of the peer group is 11.15%. So here you have us up at 17.7%, and you have a 14 nation peer group, relatively wealthy countries, down at 11.15% of GDP. Now, that's just part of the story. Now, remember, our longevity, our lifespan that we cited at the end of 2022 was 76.4. The average lifespan for the peer group, the 14 countries who are spending over 6% less, and we're going to talk about that in dollars and cents in a moment, is 82.2 years. So you not only are spending 6% of GDP less, your longevity is increasing almost 6 years to be in a peer group country. And just to put that in better perspective, here we are with a declined longevity and a huge expense of 17.7%, which comes to over $1.6 trillion. Now, that's with a T. Now, incidentally, the overspending, the 6% overspending, is almost equivalent to our annual deficits, which are running near $2 trillion. And we are mindful of expenses going on because we're in the process of of going broke, frankly, and nobody else is paying attention to it. So we're overspending the peer group of nations, 14 nations, which are relatively wealthy nations, by $1.6 trillion, more than $1.6 trillion a year. Now, the other thing I want to bring up and spend some time on is it's not only longevity that we're missing the point on. It's a number of things. For example, adjusted mortality in America, in the United States, in 2020 was 1,034.3 per 100,000 people, while in the peer group, it was 766. Now that's fully 28% below. Also, we've talked about the fact that we're losing 6 years of life, almost 6 years of lifespan in America. Another measure, maternal mortality, mothers that died during childbirth per 100,000 live births in the United States was 23.8. For Canada, it was 8.4. For Sweden, it was 7. For Switzerland, which we're going to talk about Switzerland a little too, it was 1.2%. And for the country peer group, the 14 nations that we're comparing ourselves to, it was 3.6. So out of 100,000 mothers that gave birth, 3.6 women perished in the 14 nation peer group, where 23.8 American mothers died giving childbirth. Now, also, you can look at infant mortality to age 5. We placed 33rd out of 37 Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries. That's Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They're called OECD countries. They're a little bit more than purely European countries. They include some South American countries. But we placed 33rd out of 37 for infant mortality. That's terrible, considering we're spending that much more money. And in addition, I can say that the countries that were behind us, Turkey, Mexico, Colombia, and Chile. Chile was just barely behind us, and there were 33 countries ahead of us in that study. Now, in adult obesity, okay, the U.S. ranked, and there's a funny thing about this ranking too, 13th out of 193 countries. And if you leave Kuwait out, the other 11 countries that were ahead of us in obesity were island nations like the Bahamas, and they weren't true nations. So out of 193 countries, we were second most obese behind Bahamas in the world. And so those are areas, those are actually uh, uh, there are actually 6 areas, and I think I missed one. Yeah, number of cesarean sections per 1,000 births in America were 320, and in the peer group, there were 210. Okay, so those are some statistics, every one of which we are significantly worse than the peer group, and we're overpaying 1.6 trillion. It reminds me when Obama was passing the Affordable Care Act in 2010, I remember what he said. He said, it's not going to cost us anything. You notice too, not only in this legislation, the word affordable. What a joke. Talk about an Orwellian use of words. Introduce a system that's extremely more expensive and call it affordable. Isn't that so typical of our politicians? And he said, and this is almost famous, he said, we're going to pay for it with the interest on our student debt loans. What a joke. Here we are excusing student debt loans left and right to buy votes. That is the Democratic Party, is the so-called Democratic Party. Government have taken away the monetary incentives for individuals to watch their own health in America. There's no monetary incentive anymore, and there's this blanket feeling that I'm covered, and then if you don't like the the consequence, there's 100 lawyers who are ambulance chasers that will file a malpractice suit. And I mean, it used to be 40 years ago, 50 years ago, you had a very healthy relationship with the doctor. You were paying part or all of your expense. And the doctors were fairly lenient. They would explain to you the differences in charges. They would model it specifically for your condition or your situation. And you would bear the consequence. Today we have no tolerance to bear the consequence. For God knows we don't pay for the service, and we assume that it's something it isn't. The service itself is clearly not up to what it is in many countries in the world. only in its overall expense is it just off the charts. And I remember oftentimes federal government involvement comes about because a state or a number of states is embarking in a behavior to in a behavior that's been criticized. Interstate Commerce Commission uh, took over trade due to a misunderstanding of cattle pricing between states when the railroads were getting cows to market quicker and the prices were dropping and the railroads were complaining and they nationalized it. And in this instance, you had essentially two states back last century. Massachusetts, remember Romney in Massachusetts? They tried to have, and it's a beauty of our system that allows each state to try something, and it should be a learning event for the whole nation. But unfortunately, it turns into an event that's criticized and garfed up by the federal department and made and nationalized. So you had Massachusetts with their attempt to provide medical care for all their citizens. You had California embarking in the same course. Both were disastrous. Both almost caused failures in the states. And here comes the federal government into the rescue. The tragedy is they failed to diagnose the problem. The problem is the bureaucracy is not equipped to handle the very personal medical doctor client relationships that existed without depersonalizing them. And that's the basic elemental problem that got in the way of an efficient system. And so to transfer that to the federal level, you have a whole federal government now, a bureaucratic system, essentially controlling schedules. You have non-insurance companies because they're regulated to death. They can't vary their price according to risk. I mean, if you have a 400-pound patient and a healthy 180-pound patient, you can't charge the 400-pounder more because of the risk. You have everything's been homogenized, so they're not really insurance companies anymore. The regulators have taken the variance in price out of insurance, which makes it non-insurance, and they go around, and the whole population goes around in this mythological mist, thinking they're covered until something comes up or an accident comes up, and they learn abruptly that A, there's no coverage, or B, nobody's attending to their issue, and they learn the hard way, and then you end up with an ambulance chasing doctor pursuing some form of medical malpractice. The whole situation is just pathetically sad. So all these different indexes of measurement, these different matrix, we're terrible in. And the thing is, you have there are a number of studies we cited. We refer you to our paper, which is going to be up on our website, odysseyinvestments.info, Odyssey Investments, all one word, .info, under consensus. We're posting our paper. There's a number of national studies. The paper is called Costs Outstrip Benefits of U.S. Medicine. And there's a number of studies cited. And the best one is actually the smallest group of countries, and we're number 15 in that one. And then it goes, there are 3 studies, and our standing drops even further when they do an international study with 193 nations. We're number 69. 69, for God's sake. Here we're paying fully 50% more of GDP than any country in the world, and we can only come up at number 69. I mean, that's just pathetic. And the countries in the so-called peer group were Germany, France, Japan, Australia, United Kingdom, Switzerland, Netherlands, Canada, Belgium, Sweden, Portugal, Spain, Finland. But I want to go back for a moment before we stop this and look at the Swiss system. And the reason is to try to give us to inform us on why our system is just pathetically failing and why the costs are out of control. The Swiss, and I'll sort of mention this too. When Obama was talking about implementing the Affordable Care Act, which we know wasn't affordable, but when he was talking about it, he used the Swiss system as an example, as a goal. But then when it was implemented, it was the total polar opposite. And so the reality of the Affordable Care Act was, it not only wasn't affordable, it was dysfunctionally, centrally controlled by government. The Swiss system is keynoted because it's decentralized. In Switzerland, you have 26 provinces, they call them cantons, and they're each responsible for administering their medical insurance. Now, the federal government in Switzerland does regulate the price of drugs, but other than set general guidelines, like requiring every citizen to buy insurance, they allow the cantons to control insurance within each region, the 26 regions. And the insurance policy, there are 60 actual insurance companies in Switzerland. Now, they do force everyone to buy it. So, but they don't have the same control on price. So if you're that 450-pound guy looking for a way to crawl into a coffin, you're not going to get the same price as some healthy young 25-year-old who's athletic. Okay, and don't expect it. Okay, and the fact that prices have been homogenized in America goes a long way to explain why people aren't attentive to their personal health, and consequently why 42.5% of American adults are obese. 42.5%. Matter of fact, today we're seeing a flood of pills to reduce obesity, and we're not discussing obesity, we're discussing the price of the pills to bring it down. Now, before I get back to Switzerland, I'll say something about drugs. Drugs are about 10% of the expense, and I don't focus in this podcast, don't plan to talk about that 10%. And I'll tell you why, because there's basic unanimity, nonpartisan unanimity that we're paying too much for our drugs and it's being addressed. It's the other 90% I'm concerned about that I believe is out of control, the other 90%. So back to Switzerland. So you have cantons, you have a requirement. An infant also within 90 days must have insurance. Every Swiss citizen is required to have insurance. Now, you can shop among the 60 companies. You don't have to buy the most expensive insurance, but there are minimum requirements that you do have to buy. All the 60 insurers have deductibles. So even if you buy the Cadillac and you use it for an appointment or you use it for a procedure, you pay a percentage. That forces you to be attentive to what's going on and to stay completely connected with it. So you're not only you're choosing between 60 policies, your canton is requiring them. Now, in the event that you're poor and you don't have money, you can apply in the canton for a subsidy. They're not blanketly given out. It requires each individual to apply, and you could get part of that expense subsidized. So you're talking about a country whose federal government only spends 2.5% of GDP on medicine, yet they call themselves a nationalized universal health care country, Switzerland, and nationalized health care. And then we're spending near 18% of GDP. Now, in fairness, the cantons pick up some expense, the provinces, but the policyholders bear the majority of the expense. And do you think they watch their health? Of course they watch their health. The individuals, their lifespans are up above 82 years in age compared to ours, 76.4. We've declined for two decades. So in America, you have this double-fold problem. You've transferred the responsibility of healthcare in some degree on almost every citizen to government. And when the evidence was that governments were failing miserably, the bureaucracy in California and Massachusetts failed miserably at administering healthcare. Yet the federal government used it as a reason. How they reasoned that the federal government, a bigger bureaucracy, could efficiently manage healthcare is beyond belief. So it became a political gift, and many politicians have created the feeling of entitlement among Americans for healthcare benefits, so that if you're a lower income person, we're going to pay your tab in healthcare. And that's the way we got to this position. And like I said, the services are completely out of control. Hospitals are closing. It's not going to be, I brought this topic up because I noticed the amount of bankruptcy filings and I noticed what's happening. And, I also have read some articles on how cartels will actually sell the free medical services in our emergency rooms. Any immigrant knows they can walk into an emergency room in America and say they have chest pain and cause that emergency room to spend tens of thousands of dollars on them. Actually, that's quicker than me trying to make an appointment with my general practitioner and getting a referral. And I've often thought of just walking in there myself and pretending like I was an immigrant. And so the fact that that undocumented aliens can access the system and don't pay, the fact that people aren't paying their percentage of the bill when they incur a medical expense is dramatically changing the picture. The fact that people are disconnected from their physicians. In other words, they don't have that relationship where they were a part of, if not solely responsible for the transaction with the doctor over the cost for the service or procedure. They're not a part of that. And they feel disconnected, isolated. They assume they have coverage. They don't know the detail of the coverage. And they're increasingly not likely to get a positive response, particularly with 42.5% of adults being obese in America. The fact that the political class focuses them on the 10%, the overpayment of drugs, which I agree should not be a condition, but it's almost like watch my hand, but don't watch what I'm doing behind my back. It's the 90% that's out of control. So these things are very troubling, and in a podcast that tries to set a goal of finding areas of excess spending so we can get back to a balanced budget before our nation goes broke, I felt this had to be brought up and has to be looked at. And every citizen in America ought to bear some cost directly for their own health. And I don't want to hear, well, my obesity is a bad habit. Hey, look, you should bear the consequence of your obesity. It shouldn't be all of society. if you choose that, if you choose to maintain it, there are many programs you can break bad habits, but you don't want to break the whole nation. You don't want to bust the American dollar over your bad habit. And so Americans need to wake up and take directly some of the financial responsibility. And it can be a varied scale. It doesn't have to be a large amount for lower incomes. It can be a small amount, but even if they're paying $1, they have to be out of pocket for some of these for responsibilities relating to their own personal health. And hopefully that little involvement can reconnect them with the physician and get the physician's attention off the schedule and off the litigation that they're trying to avoid too often. So I hope this was helpful. And the over 1.6 trillion we spend of GDP over anyone else is not really yielding us any fruit. The six matrix of measures of healthcare. Now, there are other measures where we're not as dismal, but the six we covered are just pathetic for the amount of money we're spending. And Americans need to wake up and take some responsibility for their own health. I recently, there's a woman I know fairly well, and she doesn't make a lot of money. And all she ever does is complain that her diabetes medication costs $400 and she has to take an inferior pill because she doesn't have the money. And the thing I can't help think of is, I mean, she weighs like 250. I said, my God, can't you just close your pie hole and stop eating so much for God's sake? You know, we have to be responsible. We can't keep seeking government cures. We have to take some responsibility for our health. And like Will Rogers said half a century ago, you think medicine is expensive? Wait till it's free. And here we are in this sort of pretend reality where many of us older citizens today have paid all our lives in Medicare, and now we're getting the benefit of Medicare, and we're very glad to get it. But these things are not going to last with this overspending habit that we've developed in this political class we have. And we better start getting rational about medicine and start reining that in, because that's an area that can profoundly change our debt picture in America. And there's no reason it can't be done like some of these other countries in a manner that expands longevity, that reduces mortality, that reduces infant mortality, that reduces maternal mortality, that reduces obesity. There's no way all those things can't be accomplished for less money. And we have many examples. Look at the peer group, 14 nations, and look at their expense and look at their statistical results. So there's a lot there's a lot to take in. Please go to the website and read our podcast. Next week, we're going to shift to a discussion of motor voter, the voting rule that was passed into law during Clinton's term, and the effect it has in sanctuary cities to allow illegals to get on voter rolls, so-called legally, even though it's not legally. And we're going to take a very close look at that, particularly since we have an election coming up, and talk about why that is, in many respects, a total failure of our current system. And also, if you do go to the website and you look at the posting today, paper number 35 or number 36, I'm not sure how many podcasts we've done. At the end of it, you'll notice I inserted natural ways to clear zombie cells. Well, we're going to have a later podcast, and I say it in that note at the bottom, on zombie cells and lectins, which are these little sort of proteins that gnaw their way through your intestines. And we're going to talk about those and the effect they may have on longevity and how to handle that in diet. So we'll do both of those. But right on in line next is going to be motor voter and sanctuary cities, counties, and sanctuary states. So I hope you all have a blessed week. I hope you have time to read our paper on the website under consensus. The paper is much better at talking about these costs than the podcast is. So hope you have time to go there and do that. It's the tail end of a beautiful 4th of July week, and it's just a bit unnerving for me to see it with all the undercurrents going on politically in the nation and the world. But we'll be talking about every one of those too in coming weeks. So for sunshine and transparency, I wish you all a blessed 4th of July weekend. We're on a Sunday here, and I hope you all have a chance to tune in next week. I look forward to seeing you, and God bless.